Deep in the remote hollows of southeastern Kentucky, where Devil's Creek winds through limestone cliffs and dense forests, local records from the 1880s contain disturbing gaps that historians have never been able to explain. Between 1881 and 1889, over 47 travelers simply vanished along the mountain trail that connected Pineville to the coal camps further east. What makes this even more chilling is that during this same period, one family, the Harlands of Devil's Creek, somehow became the largest meat supplier in 3 counties, despite owning only a modest farm with fewer than 20 head of cattle. For over a century, county officials and their descendants have refused to discuss what really happened in those mountains. But recently discovered letters and testimonies reveal a truth so horrifying that it explains why an entire community chose to bury it forever. Before we continue with the story of the Harland family and their blood-soaked legacy, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one require deep research into historical archives that most people will never see. Also, leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I love knowing where my audience discovers these forgotten American mysteries. The Devil's Creek settlement was never meant to be permanent. Most travelers who found themselves in that narrow valley were simply passing through, following the old Cherokee Trail that had been used for centuries to move between the Kentucky River Basin and the Coleridge Mountains to the east. The year was 1879, and southeastern Kentucky was experiencing its first real taste of industrial prosperity. Coal had been discovered in massive quantities throughout the Cumberland Mountains, and suddenly isolated communities that had survived on subsistence farming for generations found themselves at the center of an economic boom. New railroads were being planned, mining camps were sprouting up seemingly overnight, and most importantly for our story, there was a constant stream of workers, investors, and merchants traveling the dangerous mountain roads between established towns and these remote mining operations. Devil's Creek sat perfectly positioned along one of the most heavily traveled routes. The settlement consisted of no more than 8 families scattered across a valley floor that was barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point. Steep limestone cliffs rose on both sides, creating a natural bottleneck that forced all trail traffic through a single narrow passage. The creek itself was fed by several underground springs, keeping the water clear and cold even during the hottest Kentucky summers, making it a natural stopping point for travelers and their animals. At the head of this small community stood the Harland family homestead, a weathered log structure that had been built sometime in the 1840s by Patriarch Josiah Harland, a Kentucky native who had moved his family deeper into the mountains after losing his original farm to creditors following a series of bad harvests. Josiah had died in 1878, leaving the property to his 3 sons. Ezekiel, the eldest, at 34, Caleb 29, and Samuel, the youngest, at 26. The Harland brothers were known throughout the region as skilled butchers and meat processors, a trade they had learned from their father, who had supplemented his farming income by processing livestock for other families in the area. Their reputation was built on efficiency and quality. They could break down a full-grown steer faster than any other butchers in 3 counties, and their cured meats and sausages were prized by merchants who transported goods along the mountain trails. What made the Harlands particularly successful was their understanding of the new economic reality. While other mountain families were struggling to adapt to the changing times, the Harlands recognized that the increasing traffic along the Devil's Creek Trail represented an opportunity. Miners, investors, and merchants traveling to and from the coal camps were willing to pay premium prices for quality meat, especially preserved goods that could survive long journeys through rough terrain. By 1880, the Harlands had constructed a sophisticated smokehouse and meat processing facility behind their main cabin, complete with multiple curing chambers and a cold storage area dug deep into the hillside. Their operation was impressive enough that merchants from as far away as Lexington had begun placing regular orders for their products. particularly their renowned mountain sausage and dried beef, which seemed to have a unique flavor that customers couldn't find anywhere else. Ezekiel, the eldest brother, handled the business operations and customer relations. He was a tall, lean man with piercing gray eyes and a carefully maintained beard that gave him an air of respectability when dealing with the merchants and mining company representatives who frequented their establishment. Caleb managed the actual meat processing and preservation, applying techniques that he claimed to have learned from German immigrants who had settled briefly in the area before moving on to the coal camps. Samuel, despite being the youngest, was considered the most skilled with a knife, capable of butchering and preparing an animal with surgical precision. The brothers had never married, which was somewhat unusual for men of their age in that time and place. But they explained this by saying they were too focused on building their business to support families. They lived together in the family homestead, maintaining a routine that had them up before dawn each day to tend to their livestock and processing operations. Their closest neighbors, the Whitfield family, lived about half a mile down the creek. Thomas Whitfield and his wife Martha had 4 children and operated a small general store that served the other families in the valley, as well as passing travelers. Thomas often remarked to his wife that he couldn't understand how the Harlands managed to process so much meat with such a small herd of cattle, but he attributed it to their superior business connections and assumed they were purchasing livestock from farms outside the valley. The other families in Devil's Creek, the Rowlands, the Napiers, the Combs, and others were primarily subsistence farmers who supplemented their income by providing services to travelers, fresh water, feed for horses, simple repairs, and occasionally overnight lodging. They viewed the Harlands with a mixture of respect and envy, appreciating the prosperity the meat business had brought to their isolated community, while sometimes wondering why the brothers were so secretive about their supplier relationships. By the spring of 1881, the Harlem operation had become so successful that they were processing meat almost continuously. The sound of axes and cleavers could be heard coming from their facility at all hours, and the smoke from their curing chambers created a constant haze that hung over their end of the valley. Thomas Whitfield noted in his journal that the Harlands seemed to be working harder than ever, but their livestock herds didn't appear to be growing proportionally to their output. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came on a humid evening in late June 1881, when a Louisville merchant named Benjamin Crawford failed to arrive at the Combes family cabin where he had arranged to spend the night. Crawford was a regular traveler along the Devil's Creek route, transporting manufactured goods to the mining camps and returning with coal samples and orders for equipment. He was known for his punctuality and had never failed to arrive as scheduled in over 2 years of making the journey monthly. Crawford had been seen that morning at the Whitfield store where he had purchased supplies, and mentioned that he planned to stop at the Harland facility to place a large order for preserved meats before continuing to the Combs cabin. Thomas Whitfield remembered the conversation clearly because Crawford had been particularly excited about a new contract he had secured with one of the larger mining operations, which would require regular shipments of quality preserved foods. When Crawford didn't arrive by nightfall, Daniel Combes initially assumed the merchant had decided to push through to the next settlement rather than spend another night in the mountains. However, the next morning brought disturbing news. Crawford's horse had been found wandering loose near the limestone cliffs that bordered the eastern edge of the valley, still wearing its saddle and carrying Crawford's sample cases, but with no sign of the man himself. A search party was quickly organized, consisting of most of the adult men from the Devil's Creek families. They spent 3 days combing every accessible part of the valley and the surrounding hills, following game trails and checking every cave and crevice where a person might have fallen or taken shelter. The search was thorough and systematic, covering areas that had been explored countless times by locals over the decades. What they found was deeply unsettling. Crawford's hat was discovered caught on a branch about a /4 mile upstream from the Harland property, but there were no other traces of the man, no clothing, no personal items, and most mysteriously no body. The limestone terrain made tracking difficult, but experienced hunters in the group noted that there were no signs of an animal attack, no blood, and no disturbance of vegetation that would suggest a struggle or accident. Even more puzzling was the condition of Crawford's horse. The animal showed no signs of panic or injury, and its saddle and bridle were still properly secured. The sample cases contained Crawford's usual inventory of small manufactured items, along with a leather folder holding several hundred in payment for previous deliveries, money that no ordinary thief would have overlooked. During the search, Ezekiel Harland had been particularly helpful, offering the use of his brothers and their detailed knowledge of the local terrain. The Harlands had searched some of the most difficult areas, including several caves and abandoned mine shafts that other searchers might have missed. When no trace of Crawford could be found, Ezekiel suggested that the merchant had probably been attacked by one of the occasional drifters who passed through the area, killed for his money, and his body disposed of in one of the deep limestone sinkholes that were common throughout the region. The explanation was plausible enough that most of the search party accepted it, though some noted privately that Crawford's money had been left undisturbed. Thomas Whitfield recorded in his journal that the whole incident left him feeling uneasy, particularly because he had noticed that the Harlands seemed less concerned about Crawford's disappearance than the other families, almost as if they had expected it. 3 weeks later, a second traveler vanished under similar circumstances. This time it was James Toiver, a mining engineer from Virginia who was surveying potential railroad routes through the mountains. Toiver was traveling with a local guide, but the two men had separated when Toiver decided to take detailed measurements along Devil's Creek, while his guide continued ahead to secure lodging in the next settlement. Toiver's surveying equipment was found abandoned near the creek about 200 y.d. downstream from the Harland property. His horse was discovered the next morning, grazing peacefully in a meadow with its res dragging and its saddlebags intact. Like Crawford, Toiver had simply vanished without leaving any trace of violence or struggle. This second disappearance created genuine fear among the Devil's Creek families. Two experienced travelers, both familiar with mountain conditions and potential dangers, had disappeared within a month of each other along the same stretch of trail. The coincidence was too significant to ignore, and several families began discussing the possibility of abandoning their homes and moving to safer locations. It was Martha Whitfield who first voiced the suspicion that others were beginning to share privately. She pointed out to her husband that both disappearances had occurred very close to the Harland property, and both missing men had been known to carry substantial amounts of money. She also noted that the Harland's meat processing operation had seemed to increase significantly in recent weeks, with the smoke from their curing chambers visible almost continuously, and the sound of their work audible well into the night hours. Thomas initially dismissed his wife's concerns as the product of fear and imagination, but he began paying closer attention to his neighbor's activities. What he observed over the following weeks would haunt him for the rest of his life, and ultimately provide the key evidence that would expose one of the most brutal family operations in American frontier history. Thomas Whitfield was not an educated man in the formal sense, but 43 years of mountain living had given him the kind of practical intelligence that kept families alive in harsh environments. He understood animal behavior, weather patterns, and most importantly, he could read the subtle signs that indicated when something in his community was fundamentally wrong. The pattern he began to notice was subtle but consistent. Every few weeks, a traveler would stop at the Harland facility to purchase meat or arrange for future deliveries. Most of these visits were routine business transactions, but occasionally a traveler would arrive who was obviously carrying substantial money or valuable goods. These individuals, merchants, mining company representatives, investors, and engineers, would conduct their business with the Harlands and then simply disappear somewhere along the trail leading away from Devil's Creek. What made Thomas's observations particularly disturbing was the timing. He began keeping detailed notes in his journal, recording the dates and times when travelers stopped at various locations in the valley. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Travelers who conducted significant business with the Harlands had a much higher rate of disappearance than those who simply passed through or stopped at other locations. By the fall of 1881, Thomas had documented 7 disappearances that followed this pattern. In each case, the missing person had been seen conducting business at the Harland facility within hours of their disappearance. In each case, valuable goods or money had been left behind, ruling out simple robbery as a motive. And in each case, the Harlands had been among the most helpful participants in the subsequent search efforts, often suggesting that the missing persons had probably fallen victim to the various natural hazards that existed throughout the mountain region. Thomas's suspicions were further reinforced by changes he observed in the Harlands' operation. Their meat processing activities had increased dramatically, but their livestock herds remained essentially unchanged. When he mentioned this discrepancy to Ezekiel during a casual conversation, the eldest Harland brother explained that they had developed relationships with cattle dealers from outside the region who delivered livestock directly to their facility for immediate processing, bypassing the local markets to ensure better prices and fresher meat. The explanation was reasonable, but Thomas realized he had never seen any evidence of these cattle deliveries. The trail leading to the Harland facility was visible from several locations around the valley, and moving livestock along mountain paths was a noisy, time-consuming process that would be difficult to conceal from neighbors. Yet Thomas could not recall ever seeing or hearing cattle being driven to the Harland property, despite the obvious increase in their processing activities. More disturbing were the changes in the Harlands themselves. The 3 brothers, who had always been somewhat aloof but generally pleasant in their dealings with neighbors, became increasingly secretive and suspicious. They began discouraging casual visits to their property, claiming that their expanded business operations required strict schedules that couldn't accommodate social interruptions. They also started working primarily during nighttime hours, explaining that the cooler temperatures were better for meat processing and preservation. Thomas noted that the brothers' physical appearance was also changing. All 3 men seemed to be gaining weight despite the physically demanding nature of their work, and their clothing and equipment were obviously of higher quality than what their previous income would have supported. Ezekiel, in particular, had acquired several expensive items: a gold pocket watch, high-quality boots, and a rifle that Thomas recognized as far too costly for a mountain butcher's budget. The most unsettling change was in their attitudes toward the missing travelers. While other community members continued to express concern and organize periodic search efforts, the Harlands seemed increasingly indifferent to these disappearances. They participated in searches when specifically asked, but they never initiated efforts themselves, and they often suggested that continued searching was pointless because the missing persons had obviously left the area or fallen victim to accidents that had left their bodies in inaccessible locations. During the winter months of 1881-1882, travel along the Devil's Creek Trail decreased significantly due to weather conditions, and the disappearances temporarily stopped. This gave Thomas to consider his options carefully. He was becoming convinced that the Harland brothers were somehow responsible for the missing travelers, but he had no concrete evidence and no clear understanding of exactly what was happening. The situation became more complicated when Thomas realized that his own family's safety might be at risk. The Whitfield General Store served as an informal information center for the community, and travelers often discussed their plans and destinations while purchasing supplies. If the Harlands were indeed targeting wealthy travelers, they would need advanced information about potential victims, information that could easily be obtained by monitoring conversations at the store. Thomas began to suspect that one or more of the Harland brothers were regularly gathering intelligence about travelers, possibly by listening to conversations from concealed positions near the store, or by questioning other community members about visitors to the valley. This realization forced him to confront a terrifying possibility. His family's central role in the community's informal communication network might make them witnesses to activities that the Harlands wanted to keep secret. As spring arrived in 1882 and travel along the mountain trails resumed, Thomas made a decision that would ultimately expose the truth about the Devil's Creek disappearances. He began conducting his own careful surveillance of the Harland property, documenting their activities, and looking for evidence that would either confirm or dispel his growing suspicions. What he discovered over the following months would reveal that the Harlands' operation was far more sophisticated and brutal than anyone in the community had imagined, and that the three brothers had developed a system for murder and disposal that had allowed them to kill dozens of people while maintaining their reputation as respected members of the mountain community. Thomas Whitfield's surveillance of the Harland property began in early April 1882, when the mountain trails had dried sufficiently to resume regular travel. His approach was methodical and cautious. He understood that if his suspicions were correct, discovery could mean death, not just for himself, but for his entire family. The Whitfield cabin was positioned about half a mile downstream from the Harland homestead, but the intervening terrain included several limestone outcroppings that provided concealed observation points. Thomas began spending his early morning hours hidden among these rocks, using a spyglass that had belonged to his father during the Civil War to observe activities around the Harland facility. What he witnessed during those first few weeks of observation established patterns that would prove crucial to understanding the brothers' operation. The Harlands maintained a strict routine. Ezekiel would spend his mornings near the main trail, ostensibly tending to routine farm tasks, but actually in a position to observe all travelers passing through the valley. When individuals or small groups approached who appeared to be carrying valuable goods or substantial money, Ezekiel would engage them in conversation, often inviting them to examine the family's meat processing operation or offering to sell them preserved foods for their journey. Caleb and Samuel, meanwhile, would remain near their facility, preparing equipment and organizing their work areas. Thomas noticed that on days when wealthy travelers were expected, the brothers would make specific preparations that seemed inconsistent with normal meat processing activities. They would sharpen their knives and cleavers to an unusual degree, arrange their workspace with military precision, and position themselves in a way that suggested they were preparing for something more complex than routine butchering. The breakthrough in Thomas's investigation came on a foggy morning in late April when a well-dressed merchant named Marcus Donovan arrived in Devil's Creek with 2 pack horses loaded with manufactured goods destined for the mining camps. Donovan was obviously prosperous, wearing expensive clothing and carrying a leather case that clearly contained documents and money. He stopped at the Whitfield store to purchase supplies, mentioning casually that he was carrying payment for several large orders that totaled over $1,000, a fortune by mountain standards. Thomas realized that Donovan represented exactly the kind of target that the Harlands seemed to prefer, and he made the dangerous decision to follow the merchant when he left the store to continue his journey. Using game trails that paralleled the main path, Thomas was able to observe Donovan's interaction with Ezekiel Heron without being detected. The conversation appeared friendly and routine at first. Ezekiel complimented Donovan's horses and equipment, and the merchant responded by discussing his successful business relationships with the mining operations. When Ezekiel invited Donovan to examine their meat processing facility and consider placing an order for preserved foods, the merchant readily agreed, apparently viewing it as a normal business opportunity. What happened next convinced Thomas that his worst suspicions were correct, but also revealed the sophisticated nature of the Harlands' operation. Instead of leading Donovan directly to their main processing area, Ezekiel guided him toward a separate building that Thomas had previously assumed was used for equipment storage. This structure was positioned behind the main facility, partially concealed by trees and not visible from the main trail. From his concealed position, Thomas could see that this secondary building contained what appeared to be a specialized workspace with heavy wooden tables, metal hooks suspended from ceiling beams, and large containers that seemed designed for holding liquids. The setup was similar to their main butchering facility, but more elaborate and obviously designed for processing larger quantities of material. Ezekiel's demeanor changed as soon as he and Donovan entered this building. The friendly business-like attitude was replaced by something cold and predatory. Thomas saw Ezekiel's signal toward the main facility, and within moments Caleb and Samuel appeared, moving with the quick, coordinated efficiency of men who had performed the same actions many times before. Donovan realized his danger too late. The merchant attempted to back toward the door, but Samuel had positioned himself to block any escape route. When Donovan tried to call for help, Caleb struck him in the head with a heavy wooden mallet, dropping the man instantly to the floor. What followed was a demonstration of systematic brutality that Thomas would never be able to forget. The three brothers worked with mechanical precision, stripping Donovan of his clothing and valuables before beginning the process of butchering his body with the same techniques they used on livestock. They worked quickly and efficiently, displaying skills that could only have been developed through extensive practice. Thomas watched in horrified fascination as the Harlands systematically dismantled Donovan's corpse, separating different types of tissue and bone with surgical precision. They saved certain cuts of meat which they treated with the same preservation techniques they used for their regular products. Other portions were fed into a large grinding mechanism that reduced organic material to a consistency that could be easily disposed of. The bones were broken down and placed in containers filled with what appeared to be lye or another caustic solution which would dissolve them completely within a few days. Clothing and personal items were sorted carefully. Valuable materials were set aside for later use or sale, while items that could be traced to the victim were prepared for destruction. The entire process took less than 3 hours, and by the end of it, Marcus Donovan had been completely transformed into products that would be sold to unsuspecting customers throughout the region, or disposed of in ways that left no trace of their human origin. The Harlands cleaned their workspace thoroughly, using techniques that eliminated all evidence of what had occurred. Thomas remained in his concealed position until well after dark, watching as the brothers completed their cleanup and returned to their normal routines. By the time he made his way back to his own cabin, he was physically ill from what he had witnessed, but he was also in possession of information that could expose the Harlands' crimes and potentially save future victims. However, Thomas also realized that his situation was extremely dangerous. He was now the only living person outside the Harland family who knew the truth about their operation, and the brothers had demonstrated that they were willing and capable of murdering anyone who threatened their activities. Any attempt to expose them would require careful planning and support from law enforcement agencies that were located far from Devil's Creek and might not believe such an extraordinary story. Thomas Whitfield spent the following 3 days in a state of paralyzing indecision. The knowledge of what he had witnessed created an almost unbearable psychological burden, but he understood that any precipitous action could result in the deaths of his wife and children as well as himself. The Harlands had killed dozens of people over the course of nearly 2 years, and they had developed their murderous system to a level of efficiency that suggested they would not hesitate to eliminate any threat to their operation. The immediate problem Thomas faced was maintaining normal behavior while living in close proximity to 3 serial killers who were continuing their activities. Every interaction with the Harland brothers became a test of his ability to conceal his knowledge, and every day brought the possibility that his surveillance might be discovered or that his changed behavior might arouse suspicion. The situation became even more complicated when Thomas realized that the Harland's operation was accelerating. During the first week of May 1882, 3 more travelers disappeared under circumstances that followed the now familiar pattern. A mining engineer from Tennessee, a cattle buyer from Virginia, and a merchant carrying goods to the coal camps all vanished after being seen in conversation with Ezekiel Harland near their facility. Thomas documented each disappearance in his journal, creating a detailed record that he hoped might eventually serve as evidence. But he was becoming increasingly desperate to find a way to stop the killings without putting his own family at risk. His wife Martha had begun to notice his changed behavior and increased anxiety, and she pressed him repeatedly for an explanation of what was troubling him. The crisis point came on May 15th when a U.S. Marshal named William Patterson arrived in Devil's Creek as part of an investigation into the increasing number of missing persons reports along the mountain trails. Patterson was an experienced law enforcement officer who had been assigned to determine whether the disappearances represented a coordinated criminal operation or simply the normal hazards of mountain travel during a period of increased traffic. Patterson's arrival created both an opportunity and a deadly threat. Thomas realized that this might be his only chance to expose the Harland's crimes to someone with the authority and resources to take effective action. However, he also understood that the Marshal's investigation would inevitably lead him to question the Harland brothers, and their response to official scrutiny was impossible to predict. Thomas made the decision to approach Patterson privately, but before he could arrange a meeting, he discovered that Ezekiel Harland had already made contact with the Marshal. When Patterson stopped at the Whitfield store to purchase supplies and gather information about local conditions, he mentioned that he had received an invitation from the Harland brothers to examine their meat processing operation and discuss their observations about the missing travelers. The realization that Patterson was walking directly into the same trap that had claimed so many previous victims created a moral crisis that Thomas could no longer avoid. He understood that remaining silent would make him complicit in the Marshal's murder, but he also knew that any warning would expose him as the source of information that could have only been obtained through surveillance of the Harland's activities. Thomas made his decision based on a desperate calculation. If Patterson was killed, the federal investigation would inevitably intensify, bringing more law enforcement officers to the area and potentially creating even greater danger for his family. The only way to ensure his family's safety was to prevent Patterson's murder by exposing the Harland's operation immediately, regardless of the personal consequences. On the evening of May 16th, Thomas approached Marshal Patterson at the cabin where he was staying and requested a private conversation. What followed was one of the most difficult discussions of Thomas's life, as he attempted to convince a skeptical federal officer that 3 respected members of the mountain community were responsible for murdering dozens of innocent travelers. Patterson's initial reaction was predictable disbelief. The story Thomas told was so extraordinary that it challenged everything the Marshal thought he understood about criminal behavior in rural communities. However, Thomas had prepared for this skepticism by bringing his detailed journal, which contained precise dates, times, and observations that could be verified through independent investigation. More importantly, Thomas was able to provide specific information about the location and layout of the Harland's specialized killing facility, details that could only have been obtained through direct observation. He described the building's interior arrangement, the equipment used for dismantling bodies, and the methods employed for disposing of remains and personal belongings. Patterson agreed to investigate Thomas's claims, but he insisted on approaching the situation with extreme caution. The Marshal understood that if the allegations were true, the Harland brothers represented an unusually dangerous criminal organization that had successfully concealed their activities for an extended period. Any direct confrontation would need to be carefully planned and supported by sufficient evidence to ensure successful prosecution. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Devil's Creek intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The plan that Patterson and Thomas developed called for the Marshal to accept the Harlands' invitation to visit their facility, but with specific precautions designed to gather evidence while minimizing personal risk. Thomas would maintain surveillance from his concealed observation point, prepared to ride immediately for the nearest telegraph station if Patterson failed to emerge from the Harland facility within a predetermined time limit. However, their plan was complicated by the arrival of another potential victim. On the morning of May 17th, a wealthy investor named Charles Pemberton rode into Devil's Creek, accompanied by a pack horse loaded with surveying equipment and a leather case that obviously contained substantial funds. Pemberton was traveling to the mining camps to evaluate potential investment opportunities, and he carried authorization letters from several Eastern banking firms. Thomas realized that Pemberton represented exactly the kind of high V-value target that the Harlands preferred, and that his arrival might accelerate their timeline in unpredictable ways. The situation had become a deadly race between Patterson's investigation and the Harlands' murderous routine. With multiple lives hanging in the balance and no guarantee that law enforcement would be able to act quickly enough to prevent additional killings, Marshal Patterson's decision to proceed with his investigation of the Harland facility on the morning of May 18, 1882, was based on a calculated assessment that the risk of inaction outweighed the dangers of direct confrontation. Thomas Whitfield had provided too much specific detail for his story to be dismissed, and the federal investigation had already documented enough missing persons cases to establish a clear pattern of criminal activity. Patterson's approach was methodical and professional. He arrived at the Harland homestead at mid-morning, accepting Ezekiel's invitation to tour their meat processing operation while maintaining the pretense of a routine investigation into local conditions. However, the Marshal had taken several precautions that the Harlands were unaware of. He had left detailed notes about his planned activities with his supervisor. He carried additional weapons concealed in his clothing, and he had arranged for Thomas Whitfield to raise an alarm if he failed to return by a specified time. From his concealed observation point, Thomas watched as Patterson and Ezekiel walked toward the main processing facility, engaged in what appeared to be casual conversation. The Marshal's demeanor was relaxed and professional, giving no indication that he suspected the Harlands of any wrongdoing. Ezekiel, meanwhile, seemed to be following his normal routine for evaluating potential victims, asking questions about Patterson's background and travel plans. The critical moment came when Ezekiel attempted to guide Patterson toward the secondary building where Thomas had witnessed Marcus Donovan's murder. However, Patterson's law enforcement experience had made him naturally cautious about entering unfamiliar enclosed spaces, and he politely declined the invitation, suggesting instead that they continue their conversation in the open area near the main facility. This deviation from their normal routine seemed to alarm Ezekiel, who exchanged meaningful glances with his brothers as they emerged from the main building. Thomas could see the tension building as the Harlands realized that Patterson was not following the pattern that had made their previous victim so easy to control. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Patterson began asking specific questions about the Harlands' supplier relationships and business records. The Marshal's training had taught him to look for inconsistencies in suspects' stories, and the discrepancies in the Harlands' explanations for their increased processing activities became obvious under direct questioning. When Patterson requested to examine their business ledgers and correspondence with livestock suppliers, Caleb Harland made a subtle gesture that Thomas recognized as a signal for violence. However, instead of the quick, coordinated attack that had overwhelmed previous victims, the brothers found themselves facing an armed federal officer who was prepared for trouble. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Ezekiel attempted to strike Patterson with a heavy iron tool, but the marshal drew his revolver and shot the eldest Harland brother in the chest, mortally wounding him. Samuel tried to attack from behind, but Patterson had positioned himself carefully and was able to turn and fire a second shot that dropped the youngest brother immediately. Caleb, seeing his brothers fall, attempted to flee toward the secondary building where the family's most incriminating evidence was stored. Patterson pursued him, and Thomas left his concealed position to provide assistance. Bringing a shotgun from his cabin, Caleb was cornered in the specialized killing facility, surrounded by the equipment and tools that had been used to murder dozens of innocent travelers. What Patterson discovered in that building confirmed Thomas' account in horrifying detail. The workspace contained human remains in various stages of processing, personal belongings from multiple victims, and detailed records that Caleb had maintained documenting their criminal activities. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, establishing not only the Harlands' guilt, but also the scope and systematic nature of their operation. Caleb's capture led to a confession that revealed the full extent of the family's crimes. Under interrogation, he admitted that the brothers had been murdering and processing travelers since the spring of 1881, targeting individuals who appeared to be carrying valuable goods or substantial amounts of money. He estimated that they had killed over 50 people during their 2-year operation, processing their remains into products that were sold throughout the region. The confession also revealed the sophisticated methods the Harlands had developed for selecting victims, disposing of remains, and maintaining their reputation within the community. They had studied the travel patterns of different types of visitors, identifying merchants, investors, and mining company representatives as the most profitable targets. They had perfected techniques for eliminating all traces of their victims, using chemical processes to dissolve bones and systematic approaches to destroying or recycling clothing and personal belongings. Most disturbing was Caleb's matter-of-fact description of how the family had integrated human meat into their regular products, selling it to unsuspecting customers throughout eastern Kentucky. He claimed that their special blend, sausages, and cured meats had developed such a reputation for quality that they had customers who traveled significant distances specifically to purchase Harland products. The revelation that hundreds of people had unknowingly consumed human flesh created a wave of revulsion that extended far beyond the immediate community. News of the Harland family's crimes spread rapidly through the mountain regions and eventually reached newspapers in Louisville, Lexington, and other major cities. The story became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Kentucky history, generating headlines across the country and establishing the Devil's Creek murders as one of the most horrific examples of serial killing in 19th century America. The aftermath of the Harland family's exposure brought profound changes to Devil's Creek and the surrounding mountain communities. Caleb Harland was transported to the county seat for trial, where he faced charges of multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and desecration of human remains. His confession provided prosecutors with detailed evidence of crimes that had been committed over a 2-year period, but the full scope of the family's activities would never be completely documented due to the thoroughness with which they had destroyed evidence. Caleb's trial became a sensation that attracted attention from across Kentucky and neighboring states. Newspaper reporters traveled to the remote mountain community to document the story, creating the first detailed press coverage that Devil's Creek had ever received. The testimony revealed not only the brutal nature of the Harlands' crimes, but also the sophisticated methods they had employed to avoid detection for such an extended period. The evidence presented during the trial included the specialized equipment found in the Harlands' killing facility, personal belongings recovered from dozens of victims, and business records that documented the sale of human-derived products throughout the region. Expert witnesses testified about the chemical processes the brothers had used to dissolve bones and destroy other physical evidence. techniques that were advanced enough to suggest significant planning and preparation. Most damaging to Caleb's defense was the detailed journal he had maintained, documenting not only the dates and methods of individual murders, but also his observations about which types of victims provided the best quality meat and the most valuable personal belongings. The journal entries revealed a level of cold calculation that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers and court officials. The trial also exposed the extent to which the Harland products had been distributed throughout eastern Kentucky. Investigators traced sales records and customer lists, discovering that the brothers' specialty meats had been purchased by hotels, restaurants, mining camps, and private individuals across a region covering several counties. The realization that hundreds of people had unknowingly consumed human flesh created a public health crisis that required extensive investigation and counseling. Thomas Whitfield's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, providing the only eyewitness account of the Harlands' methods and the systematic nature of their operation. His detailed surveillance records and journal entries established a timeline that correlated with missing persons reports from across the region. However, his role in exposing the crimes also made him and his family targets for revenge from those who had sympathized with the Harlands or who blamed him for bringing unwanted attention to their isolated community. The psychological impact on the Devil's Creek community was devastating and long-lasting. Families who had lived peacefully as neighbors for decades discovered that they had been unknowingly sharing their valley with serial killers who had viewed them as potential sources of information about profitable victims. The trust and social cohesion that had characterized the mountain community was permanently shattered. Several families, including the Whitfields, chose to abandon their homes and relocate to other areas rather than continue living in a place associated with such horrific crimes. The Harland property was seized by the county and eventually destroyed, but the specialized killing facility was preserved temporarily as evidence for potential appeals or related prosecutions. Caleb Heron was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. However, he died in his jail cell before the sentence could be carried out, apparently from a heart condition that had been worsened by the stress of imprisonment and trial. His death eliminated any possibility of recovering additional information about victims who had not been identified or about other potential accomplices who might have assisted the family's operation. The broader investigation revealed connections between the Harland crimes and similar disappearances in other parts of Appalachia, suggesting that the brothers might have been part of a larger network of criminals who preyed on travelers along mountain routes. However, these connections were never fully explored due to the limited resources available to law enforcement agencies in remote areas and the difficulty of coordinating investigations across state and county boundaries. Marshal Patterson received commendation for his role in exposing the Harlem operation, but he also requested transfer to a different assignment, stating that the psychological impact of the case had affected his ability to work effectively in mountain communities. His official report became a model for investigating organized criminal activities in isolated rural areas, and his methods were studied by law enforcement agencies throughout the country. The Devil's Creek murders had lasting effects on travel and commerce throughout the eastern Kentucky mountains. Merchants and other travelers became much more cautious about stopping at isolated facilities or accepting invitations from strangers regardless of how respectable they appeared. The incident contributed to demands for improved law enforcement presence in remote areas and better communication systems that could coordinate responses to criminal activities across jurisdictional boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, the case established precedents for prosecuting crimes that involved the systematic processing and distribution of human remains. The legal challenges presented by the Harlands operation required courts to address questions about evidence preservation, victim identification, and public health protection that had rarely been encountered in American criminal law. The economic impact on the region was also substantial. The revelation that human meat had been sold as livestock products created lasting suspicion about the authenticity of meat products from mountain suppliers, damaging the reputation of legitimate businesses throughout eastern Kentucky. Several meat processing operations were forced to close permanently due to customer concerns, and it took decades for the regional food industry to recover fully from the scandal. Local folklore and oral traditions preserved stories about the Harland family crimes for generations, though these accounts often became exaggerated or distorted over time. Some versions of the story included supernatural elements or suggested that the brothers possessed unusual abilities that explained their success in avoiding detection. However, the official records and court testimony make clear that their operation succeeded through careful planning, systematic execution, and the isolation of their mountain location rather than any extraordinary capabilities. The abandoned sites associated with the Harland operation became local landmarks that were generally avoided by residents and visitors alike. The area where their homestead had stood remained empty for decades, and few people were willing to settle or work in that part of the valley. Even today, more than a century after the crimes were exposed, some local residents report feeling uncomfortable when traveling through the area where Devil's Creek winds passed the former Harland property. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of travelers in remote areas during the late 19th century, when communication was limited and law enforcement resources were stretched thin across vast territories. The Harlands' ability to operate undetected for over 2 years demonstrated how geographic isolation could provide cover for criminal activities that would have been impossible to sustain in more densely populated areas. Modern criminologists and historians who have studied the Devil's Creek murders consider them significant not only for their scale and brutality, but also for the methodical approach the perpetrators employed. The Harlands developed what amounts to an early example of organized serial killing with systematic victim selection, sophisticated disposal methods, and integration of criminal proceeds into legitimate business operations. The psychological profiles that have been constructed based on available evidence suggest that the three brothers shared personality traits that made their collaboration in these crimes possible, but also that their operation required a level of planning and coordination that went beyond simple criminal opportunism. Their ability to maintain normal social relationships within their community while simultaneously conducting a systematic murder operation represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Educational institutions and law enforcement training programs continue to study the Harland case as an example of how criminal organizations can operate successfully in isolated communities, and how the social dynamics of small rural populations can both facilitate and eventually expose such activities. The role that Thomas Whitfield played in documenting and reporting the crimes has been analyzed as a model for civilian involvement in criminal investigations, though his experience also illustrates the personal risks that such involvement can entail. The physical evidence from the Harland operation was eventually destroyed after all legal proceedings were completed, but detailed documentation of their methods and equipment was preserved in court records and law enforcement files. These materials have provided valuable insights for investigators working on similar cases in other locations and time periods. This mystery shows us how evil can hide behind the mask of respectability, and how entire communities can be deceived by those who exploit their trust and isolation. The Harland family's crimes remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal, who integrate themselves into communities and earn the respect of their neighbors while secretly conducting activities of unimaginable brutality. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there have been other accomplices who escaped justice? The evidence suggests that the Harland operation was too sophisticated for 3 men acting alone, yet no other perpetrators were ever identified. Leave your comment below with your theories about what really happened in those Kentucky mountains. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The mountains of Appalachia hold many more secrets, and we'll continue exploring them together. See you in the next video.